CNN, 7th of June 2023, the newest crack in relations is the expulsion of journalists from China and India. The newest indication of deteriorating relations between the two most populous countries in the world is that India and China are quickly moving toward having few or no accredited journalists on the ground in each other's countries. On Friday, New Delhi urged Chinese authorities to facilitate the continued presence of Indian journalists currently working and reporting there, adding that the two countries remain in touch about the situation. According to a source in India's media with direct information, Beijing has suspended the credentials of 3 of the 4 journalists from prominent Indian publications based in China since April. Beijing said last week that only one Chinese journalist left in India due to that nation's unfair and discriminatory treatment of its journalists, and that journalist's visa had not yet been extended. When asked about a piece on the recent expulsions of journalists in The Wall Street Journal, which broke the story, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning stated, "The Chinese side has no choice but to take appropriate countermeasures." The circumstance is the most recent flashpoint in the strained relationship between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. It has worsened recently due to increasing nationalism in both nations and unrest at their disputed border. At a time when there is little room for misunderstandings, the reduction of journalists, including those from China's government-run state media and those from major Indian outlets, is likely to worsen those relations and each country's understanding of the other's political and social circumstances. After a long-running territorial dispute culminated in a violent clash in Aksai-Chin Ladakh in 2020, tensions between the two have remained high. In April, India's defense minister charged China with breaking pre-existing border agreements and eroding the entire basis of the two countries' diplomatic ties. 2020 saw China accuse the U.S. of a political crackdown after the U.S. reduced the number of Chinese citizens permitted to work in Chinese state media bureaus there, citing the surveillance, harassment, and intimidation of foreign journalists in China and the need to level the playing field. Beijing retaliated by ejecting journalists from several influential U.S. newspapers. Additionally, each side imposed visa restrictions on the media outlets of the other. Following the expulsions of American newspapers, Beijing's harassment of journalists with Australian outlets, and protracted delays in visa clearances amid a more demanding and unfriendly media environment for international reporters, the number of foreign journalists in China has decreased recently. Visa Row. Hu Xiaoming, the bureau chief for Xinhua's New Delhi office since 2017, wrote a first-person account of the torment of Chinese reporters' visa hassle in India on Sunday. The Indian government's brutal treatment has put enormous psychological pressure on Chinese journalists in India, said Hu, who claimed that the Indian government denied his request for a visa renewal in March because he had been there too long. The New Delhi branch of Xinhua now has only one journalist working with a valid visa, according to the story, due to India's visa regulations. When asked in a routine briefing on Friday about the number of Chinese journalists working there, a representative for India's Ministry of External Affairs declined to respond. According to spokeswoman Arindam Bagchi, all foreign journalists, including Chinese journalists, have been pursuing journalist activities in India, without any restrictions or difficulties in reporting. While Bagchi did not confirm that any Indian journalists had lost their credentials in China, he claimed they had encountered challenges while working there. In an article published in April, The Hindu Daily reported that China's foreign ministry had chosen to freeze the visas of 2 journalists, Anshuman Mishra of Indian public broadcaster Prasar Bharati and its Beijing correspondent Anant Krishnan. When questioned about the actions at the time, a representative of the Chinese Foreign Ministry claimed that Beijing was taking steps in response to the unfair treatment of its reporters in recent years, notably the expulsion of the Xinhua reporter in March. The official claimed that the incident came after one in 2021 in which a state-run CGTN reporter with a valid visa was instructed to depart. Beijing has not disclosed whether any other Chinese journalists outside of India have current, valid India visas. China keeps strict control over its state media, which it sees as a means of exporting its propaganda messages. A Western correspondent who is one of many people in line for a visa to China said the predicament facing Indian journalists was in keeping with a pattern we've seen in the past few years connecting the approval of journalist visas in China to the granting of visas for state media reporters in other countries, and bilateral relations more broadly. Conversely, India is receiving more criticism for what some observers perceive to be declining press freedoms and restrictions. Years after the nation outlawed a BBC documentary critical of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's suspected involvement in deadly riots more than 20 years ago, Indian officials raided BBC newsrooms in New Delhi and Mumbai on suspicion of tax evasion. Simmering conflict. The most recent incident involving journalists from both nations boils down to the complete erosion of trust between both governments, according to Manoj Kwalramani, a fellow for China Studies at the Takshashila Institution in Bengaluru. According to Kwalramani, as Chinese journalists work for state-run media organizations, New Delhi probably views them as state actors. This might be an instance of India's plan to impose costs on China that do not require military escalation but can nevertheless put pressure on Beijing to restore the status quo along the border, he said, if New Delhi was not approved their reporter visas, as Beijing claimed. Since the conflict in 2020, India has retaliated against China in several ways, including outlawing TikTok and other well-known Chinese apps and moving to prevent Chinese telecoms giants Huawei and ZTE from supplying its 5G network. TikTok and other well-known Chinese apps are banned because they are threats to sovereignty and integrity, according to India. The Indian government has strengthened ties with the US through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, a grouping of Japan, the US, India, and Australia widely regarded as a counterweight to an assertive China, amid worries in New Delhi that China is becoming a more potent regional force. In the Himalayan region of Jammu and Kashmir, India sponsored a Group of 20, G20, tourism summit that China abstained from last month, citing its opposition to holding any kind of G20 meetings in disputed territory. Both India and Pakistan claim the whole of the disputed Kashmir area. According to an announcement from this year's host, India, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will meet this summer, but virtually, eliminating what would have been the next anticipated opportunity for an in-person, face-to-face meeting between Modi and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Lessening the number of Indian reporters in China will hurt India's ability to understand China more in depth. It may also be detrimental to Beijing, according to Kwalramani. Beijing has been telling New Delhi and the Indian people for a long time to have an independent view of China, as opposed to looking through the Western prism, he said. How do we create that independent perspective if you deny our reporter access to the country?